Hello, historians. Now that we are familiar with the geography and early peoples of the Fertile Crescent, we're going to talk more specifically about some of the civilizations that developed in the area. So, when we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we are talking about an area of land. We're not talking about just one civilization. The Fertile Crescent would be inhabited by many different civilizations over the course of the years, sometimes competing directly with each other and sometimes coming one after the other in succession. But the very first major advanced society to develop in the area we call the Sumerians, or the Sumerian civilization. Many historians will say this is actually the world's first civilization, and by some metrics, that's certainly right. It's one of the earliest civilizations to achieve a high level of urbanization, one of the first civilizations to achieve writing. Many of the marks of what we consider a civilization today, we have the first examples of these things in ancient Sumer. So there's certainly some merit to this being the oldest civilization. Certainly people existed for many thousands of years in different configurations prior to this, but in terms of a recognizable civilization that we have specific artifacts and writing from today, you can't go wrong saying the Sumerians were certainly among the first. So much so that we don't really know much about where they came from, or when they moved into the region. Other later civilizations we know from whence they came, right? So later on, when the Akkadians show up, we'll know that they're coming from the north because we'll have Sumerian accounts of their arrival, but we don't have any real information on where Sumerians were from before they were living in the area. So their society became based around the idea of a city-state. Now, if you're familiar with city-states, you're probably familiar with ancient Greek, or at least classical Greek, city-states. So Athens was a city that had its own area of influence, as was Sparta, as was Thebes. These different Greek cities exerted control over the surrounding area. So that's the same type of idea we're talking about when we talk about the city-states of Sumer. Now, most people in Sumer were still farmers. They lived in rural, countryside areas where the ground was good for farming. This would be the case for many hundreds or really thousands of years in human history. While we learn most about the cities because that's where most artifacts can be found, obviously you have a lot of people living in one area, you'll have a lot of artifacts. So we tend to think just of the cities, but most people didn't live in a city during this time period or really up until very recent times. However, that doesn't mean the cities weren't important because they were really the focus of the civilization or of the culture. So the centers of Sumerian society were the more urban areas that we would recognize as a city, right? So these are functional regions, as we learned earlier, these city-states. They'd be centered around a powerful city, but obviously you cannot grow the amount of food that you need to feed a city within the city itself. So farms and villages would have to develop all around the city, and together this represented the city-state. So some cities in Sumer had 10,000 people in them, which isn't too big for a modern city, but certainly very large compared to anything else that was around. But over time, historians think that by 2000 BC, which is still very, very early on in our recorded history, that some cities had up to 100,000 residents, which is a level of urban development that we would not see again after the fall of Mesopotamian civilizations for many, many years. So very advanced and populous cities began to develop. So each of these city-states had countryside around it, and the more countryside a city-state could control, the more food it could bring in, meaning that more people could then move to the city and not be farmers anymore, right? So this goes back to the idea we were talking about earlier of specialization. If you have enough food, then not everybody needs to be a farmer, and they can specialize in other areas, right? So the more farmland a city-state was able to acquire, the higher surplus of food it had, and so the more people were able to go into other professions and advance those professions and advance the level of technology available in each of these city-states, right? So farmland was an important resource, not just because of the food itself, but because having a surplus of food allowed you to develop in ways that you couldn't if everybody needed to be a subsistence farmer, right? So in order to defend all of this countryside, each city-state would develop its own military, and stronger city-states controlled larger areas than small ones. So in practice, it's not like every city-state fought every other one. After all, even if you're a pretty strong city-state and you attack a weaker one, you're still going to lose something in that war. And so if you can manage instead an agreement where some people pay tribute to others and they say, okay, you're technically in charge, you're technically the king or whatever, we'll pay you taxes or we'll pay you tribute if you kind of just leave us alone, right? So sometimes city-states grew by physically conquering other ones, and sometimes they grew by intimidating other ones into more or less joining their empire. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about Sargon. So each of these city-states need to maintain their army to control the farmland around their cities. As a result, likewise, to make the cities stronger, they would build thick walls around the cities. So in all the archaeological evidence we have of these ancient Mesopotamian cities, nearly all of them have fairly substantial walls, because before the invention of gunpowder and things like that, a well-supplied city with large walls would take a disproportionately inconvenient amount of time to actually conquer, right? Having walls around your city makes it much easier to defend. And so pretty much every city was building huge walls for their own protection to supplement their military, protecting their area. Some city-states that were directly along the Tigris or Euphrates River also became important centers for trade, and they were able to export things up and down the river from as far away as North Africa or as far away as Afghanistan in the other direction. So city-states became even more important because they were centers of trade as well. So you can get things in these city centers that you couldn't get elsewhere. These city-states gained and lost power over time, right? So in the many thousands of years that we constitute the Sumerian civilization, different cities rose and different cities fell, right? So one of the earlier cities that we know of, Kish, became very popular around 3500 BC. But over the next 1,000 years, the center of power moved to the rivals of Uruk and Ur for dominance. One of Uruk's kings, known as Gilgamesh, became a legendary figure in Sumerian literature. So I want to point out that the reason this is so important is not just because of the particular story of Gilgamesh, although it's a very interesting story if you like ancient myths and things. We'll talk more about Gilgamesh later. But it's most notable in that it's actually the first piece of literature that we have, right? It's not simply an account of a real king. It is a story of a half-king, half-divine figure who basically has to, go on a series of quests, as you often do in mythology, right? So much like the myth of Hercules or something like that, we have somebody who's half god, half mortal, and who has to go on a quest to aid humanity in some way. So Gilgamesh is like the first figure in literature that we know of specifically, predating anything else we really know of. But the fact that they had literature at all shows how advanced the Sumerians were, because in order to have literature, you need to have writing, and that's no small task to develop as a civilization. So we'll get into the importance of that later on. So as these Sumerian city-states kind of go back and forth, it's not that they're the only people in the area. So we'll discuss the rise of the Akkadian Empire. They were also based around the Tigris and Euphrates River, populated by a people that we'll call Akkadians today, and they lived to the north of Sumer, but they were not Sumerians. They didn't consider themselves just one of the city-states. They even spoke a different language, right? So the Akkadians and the Sumerians did live side by side for a number of years, However, in about 2300 BC, we have the emergence of the leader Sargon, who would be known as variously Sargon the Great, or many different other things. And he sought to really expand Akkadian territory. He built a new capital, creatively named Akkad, or Akkad, on the Euphrates River, pretty close to what is now the modern city of Baghdad. So it's interesting that one of the most important modern cities in the area was really the same general location as historically important cities like Akkad or Babylon, which we'll talk about later on. Sargon was the first ruler to have a permanent army that he used to actually launch wars against other kingdoms, right? So in most of these city-states, the armies were not permanent. They would call up the armies to defend the city-state when they needed to, or to go on a certain mission, or to attack a certain other country. But the vast majority of the time, there was not a standing army. Instead, people were farming, they were doing other stuff, and they took up their weapons when the king commanded it. But Sargon had a permanent professional army, so you had people whose job it was to be soldiers, and they practiced being soldiers, and that was their main task. And so it's not surprising that they got pretty good at it, right? So Sargon's soldiers managed to defeat all of the city-states of Sumer. They conquered northern Mesopotamia and brought the whole region under the rule of Sargon. This is why we call it the First Empire. So it had different territories. It had Sumerians, it had Akkadians, it had northern Mesopotamians, and they were all separate people, but they were under the same ruler, in this case, Sargon. So that's what makes it the First Empire, rather than just a kingdom, of which each city-state was a kingdom. Now we have an empire, one person ruling over multiple kingdoms. The Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and he was not the ruler for very long, right? He lived a good life for somebody of the time period, but within 50 years of his death, the Akkadian Empire had really collapsed, and various different tribes or different city-states and people had clawed back a lot of the power and land that had been lost. The city-state, the Sumerian city-state of rebuilt most of its strength, and in the aftermath of the chaos of Sargon's empire collapsing, it was the people of who managed to conquer the rest of the Mesopotamia this time. Political stability was restored for a bit, and the Sumerians were on top, but this would not last forever. One of the other marks of civilization that we want to talk about is the development of religion. So because it's one of the earliest civilizations, it's also one of the earliest religions that we know about, or has one of the earliest religions that we know about. So Sumerians practiced a polytheistic religion. Polytheism means the worship of many different gods or deities. There were various different gods who were said to have different domains, like we might be used to in the mythology of other classical civilizations as well. So for instance, there was a god who was the lord of the air, or who was the god or goddess of love or of war. The sun and moon were represented by specific gods, as is the idea of wisdom. Interestingly, they had separate gods for freshwater and saltwater, showing how important the difference between water types was to the Sumerians, that they really considered them different elements enough that different gods were in charge of them, as opposed to the Greeks having someone like Poseidon, who's just like in charge of water generally. The Sumerians recognized that different types of water have very different types of usages, and so perhaps they're represented by different gods or deities. The Sumerians believed that gods had these enormous powers and could bring good harvests or floods. And remember, the cycle of flooding is very important to the development of civilization, and so the idea that you could do something like pray to a god to influence the weather in this way was actually really important. If there was like even the slightest chance that it could possibly work, as a Sumerian farmer, you wanted to do it because your livelihood depended on it, right? So while we might not be able to say of any ancient civilization, like how much the average person truly believed in each of the gods and how much it was more regional or more personal. We don't know, but we do know that you at least had a big incentive that you might as well believe in the gods and pray and do these other things on the off chance that it helped, because these natural processes, like the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates River, literally determined the course of your civilization's success or your own personal farm's success, right? So in that way, you would also, if you saw other people not believing in the religion, you might even be upset with them because everybody's kind of depending on these natural processes to go right. So if you're able to influence it with religion, you definitely should. So we don't know too much about how the average person interacted with religion, but we do know that it was very important, and there are many religious artifacts amongst the most popular type of artifact that we found. So we do know that it was very important overall. Priests, who were people who performed religious ceremonies, had great status in Sumer. So they didn't call them priests, obviously. We call them priests because we think they're kind of the equivalent of modern priests, but important religious people who were thought to be able to interpret the wishes of the gods more so than the average person, and were able to make offerings to them more so than the average person. They would run the temples, special buildings where priests performed their religious ceremonies. We'll talk more about these temples later on, as they really develop into being a very important part of the society as more than just religious places. The social order in general became more stratified during this time period. So because you have enough surplus of food and people can do different jobs, people can be seen in different ways, we have some of the first social rankings or class rankings, right? Different types of people that are seen as more or less important. So the kings or queens, the royalty of a city, would certainly be the most important. Often they were thought to be partly divine themselves, and the priests who were right below them would certainly build up this idea, right? If you're a priest working for one of the kings, you're of course going to say that the gods support this king, to the extent that maybe this king is really even like part god themselves. We see this much more explicitly in Egypt, where the pharaohs are actually considered to be living gods, and something similar happens in ancient Rome as well. We don't know how literal they thought it was in all of these instances, but there was kind of a merging of this authority at the top. So the kings and queens would be at the top of the social hierarchy. The priests would say that the gods themselves must have chosen these kings and queens to rule, because the gods certainly wouldn't allow people to rule who they didn't want. After all, they're gods, right? Below the priests, though, were Sumer's skilled craftspeople and merchants and traders. They all had a great impact on Sumerian society, especially traders who traveled to faraway places and were able to exchange some of the surplus grain that was grown in the Fertile Crescent for more rare things like copper or lumber or precious stones. So these skilled traders were only able to exist because farmers were able to create excess food through all of these big irrigation projects that we talked about. While Sumer was a civilization of many firsts, probably the most important of these early inventions or discoveries we want to talk about in ancient Sumer is that of writing. So, ancient Sumer developed a method of writing, or a system of writing, called cuneiform. Cuneiform was a series of marks that were usually made with a dried reed into a wet clay tablet. So, not having access to paper or earlier versions of paper, things like Egyptians used papyrus, they would write directly into wet clay, which would then harden and make a permanent record of what they wrote. Cuneiform is considered the first system of writing because it is not pictographical, which means earlier forms of communication used essentially little pictures in order to convey meaning, right? So the symbol for bird looked like a bird, and the symbol for water looked like a running river. And you could only get so complicated with these ideas, right? When you're trying to communicate a complex idea through pictures, a lot can get lost in translation. But cuneiform is actually a phonetic way of writing, meaning that the symbols relate to sounds rather than to actual things. So you can combine the symbols in a bunch of ways and be able to write many more words with much more complex meanings, right? So earlier, they did have specific meanings attached to specific symbols, but as cuneiform developed over the course of Sumerian civilization, the symbols became more abstract and became closer to something like we would call letters today. Now, the ability to read and write was not even across all of ancient Sumeria. It took a long time to learn and to perfect, and so you needed a specialist whose job it was really to learn to read and write appropriately. So these people were called scribes, and scribes would be hired to document anything that needed documentation. So the earliest works in cuneiform that we have are mostly business transactions. So merchants or traders would hire a scribe to help keep track of all of their accounts, right? You would say who owes who what prices different things are selling for, all of that kind of business information. Also, it kept contracts as well. So if people agreed on a business arrangement, a scribe could write up sort of an early contract saying what the business arrangement was, so that if it was violated, they can then, go to the king or whatever official is relevant to receive justice for the broken contract, right? So being able to agree to things in writing and being able to keep track of accounts in writing was really important for early, essentially, business. But scribes worked for the government as well. So when the government produced a law or anything that it needed to communicate to citizens, scribes would write that, and then it could be distributed across either the city or the city-state or even the empire. This is important because it means that laws aren't transmitted through word of mouth, right? It's not somebody saying, oh, the law over here is this. You could actually write it down, and everybody can see it so that you know it's fair. Everybody's looking at the same thing. It's the same law in all the places because it's written down and distributed rather than told from person to person. Sumerians realized pretty early on the importance of writing, and so schools were not an uncommon thing in Sumerian city-states. They were actually even not too far from what we would probably picture in terms of a school, someplace where you really went to learn to read or write, where you went when you were sort of younger, before you were helping in the fields or anything like that. Certainly not everybody, or even close to everybody, learned to read or write, but it was at least an option that even relatively average people could learn, which wouldn't be the case in a lot of other civilizations that developed writing. But writing wasn't only used for these sort of business and government ideas. Writing was also used for what we use a lot of writing for, which is actually art. So developing works of fiction, poetry, all of these things could be recorded now that we had writing. So they were able to record their own history, for example. So they wrote poems about their military victories or about their great cities. And that's how we have a lot of information that we wouldn't have had if they didn't have the ability to write it down. Some of these longer poems became called what we would call epics today, so stories of heroes like you might be familiar with from ancient Greece or Rome. The Epic of Gilgamesh was probably the most important of these stories, the story of the legendary Sumerian king Gilgamesh and his quest variously to achieve immortality or understand the meaning of life itself. But either way, a hero who goes on an adventure and overcomes obstacles, really the first version of that story, which so many other stories would follow in the footprints of, is written down for the first time in ancient Sumer. Writing, of course, wasn't the only notable advance that we have from the Sumerians. Equally up there with writing has to be the invention of the wheel. Sumeria is the first civilization we have archaeological evidence of using wheels, so they would be able to use wheels to not only use wagons and carts and things more effectively, which was very important for transporting the mud bricks that they used to build their buildings from the sites where they would form the mud at the rivers all the way to the cities, so it made that a lot easier. But wheels also were really important for pottery, so today we have the idea of a potter's wheel, and it spins and you're able to throw a pot or a jar or a bowl more effectively. these were invented in ancient Sumer as well, and it enabled them to create a lot of interesting and useful ceramics that made life a lot easier. So you could, store water more effectively if you were able to create a really large jar. You could store grain for the off-season if you're able to create containers through your ceramics that are appropriate for that. So it really increased the flexibility of the things that they could build. They also invented the plow. It's the first archaeological example we have of a plow. So a plow would be something dragged behind either people or domesticated animals, if any were available. And it would kind of turn the soil over, so you dig up the underlayers of the soil and move them on top. And this way the nutrients that were locked too far below the surface get turned up and the plants are able to be more successful. So agriculture, along with everything they did in terms of irrigation, was also improved by their plow technology. They were among the first people in the world to build sailboats, so we don't know that they were the absolute first. But while a lot of the transportation that they engaged in on the rivers was with oars or poles, they also invented sailboats as well. So they figured out how to use sails to harness the power of the wind so that their ships could move more efficiently. And they were able to trade greater distances by using these sails. The cities themselves were advanced in a number of ways. They had rudimentary sewers, so if you had 100,000 people all living in the same city, you obviously needed some sort of hygienic system, and they were able to build sewers under city streets, something that wouldn't really show up again for many hundreds or even thousands of years in some other civilizations. They invented a clock that used falling water to measure time, so realizing that water always flows at the same rate in the same circumstance. Sumerians were able to create tools out of bronze, which is why we call them a Bronze Age civilization, bronze tools being much more efficient than stone tools in construction. In terms of math and science, Sumeria made a couple of really important advances. Their system of math was based on the number 60, so unlike ours, which uses base 10, theirs was based on the number 60 because it was easy to divide a circle into 360 degrees, and from there you could divide your year into 12 months, factor of 60. And so we get a lot of things that still exist today, like there being 12 months, all the way back from ancient Sumerian math. So their calendar was actually pretty accurate to ours, all things considered, which is very impressive considering that they had to base it on math and astronomy. In terms of science, we have cuneiform records of descriptions of all the various types of plants, animals, and minerals that would have been available in the area, so it's clear that they studied their environment very carefully and in a methodical sort of way, so they understood the properties of each plant and wrote it down so that they can build their knowledge in that way as well. One of the most important ways that we know about ancient Sumeria today is actually through their art and architecture. Obviously, for a couple of reasons. One, if you're creating art and architecture, you're also creating artifacts, right? So your architecture is something that's likely to have the best shot at making it through these thousands of years. If you construct a big temple or some such, the odds that that's going to remain intact higher than, a particular jar of pottery or whatever. So we have really important artifacts, but also because art says something about the people who create it, right? The type of art that people create says something about the society that they're from. We have Sumerians themselves telling us what is important to them during their lifetimes, right? Because that's what they create their art to represent. So in terms of architecture, rulers would live in larger palaces, as is probably to be expected. Most homes in a city were pretty standardized because it was easy to construct them if you constructed them in sort of the same way. So wealthier people might have had a bit of a bigger house, but it still would have been pretty similar to all the others. One of the important features of domestic architecture in Sumer was that houses were built around a small courtyard so that people inside would still have access to the outside, but in a private sort of way. We see courtyard-based development in a lot of ancient civilizations because it's just very useful during the time period to have access to the outdoors. Probably the thing that dominated the center of these cities, though, were the temples. So the temples, which we refer to today as ziggurats, are large pyramid-shaped towers that could rise significantly above the other buildings in a city, right? So think of a pyramid, but a layered or stepped pyramid, and that's a ziggurat. Ziggurats would be massive construction projects which would dwarf other things in the city to show their importance. They had staircases which led to the very top where there would be a shrine. Usually it would be devoted to a particular god or goddess based on the city. So each city kind of had a patron god or a god that they were particularly devoted to. And so the main ziggurat of the city might be devoted to that god, and the shrine on top would be for making sacrifices or performing other religious ceremonies in their name. These temples ended up being incredibly important for Sumerian society because they took on more than just a religious role. We'll get more into that in the Agriculture of Ancient Mesopotamia packet. But the temples really became the center of not just religious life, but also economic life in these cities. The temples were big institutions that played an important role in being able to organize regional agriculture, work, and defense. So there was a real uniting of politics and religion during the time period. Probably the most famous type of artifact that we have from ancient Sumeria are seal cylinders. So seal cylinders are essentially small stone cylinders that have designs engraved in them, which are pretty hard to do because the cylinders aren't that big. So you need to be very skilled in order to create an intricate design engraved on them. And when you took this cylinder and you rolled it over wet clay, it would leave behind the imprint of what you carved, right? So each seal would leave its own distinct imprint because they were carved with different things. And as a result, each of these cylinders was personal to the person who made it, or at least to the person who it was made for. So this is essentially like a super early photocopier. You make something on your cylinder, and then you can create as many copies as you would like quickly by rolling it across clay. This is useful for a lot of different things. So, for example, cylinder seals were used to sign documents, right? So you would write out the contract on a clay tablet, and then each person would roll their seal over it in order to sign it. Or you can use it as labels, all right? So if you made one that essentially said, like, this is wheat, you would then roll it on your pots where you're going to store wheat as like a way of making labels, which was very useful for early trade. So these seal cylinders had a lot of practical functions, but they were also used just artistically, and designs were carved into them or representations of daily life. There were other types of art as well. So jewelers in the region were able to work gold, silver, and gemstones into jewelry. Some of the earliest decorative jewelry we have is from this time period, and it actually takes a lot of metalworking knowledge to be able to figure out how to make some of this impressive jewelry. So we know not only is it useful for art, but it was probably useful for a number of different types of crafts to learn how to work with metal in such a detailed way. So there's obviously a lot more to it than that, and we'll dive into Sumerian art and architecture more probably during a later session. That's kind of an overview of the Sumerian people and a little bit of the Akkadians thrown in there. Main takeaways that we want from Sumeria are definitely the process of urbanization and the development of a city-state. So how surplus generated food leads to specialization of labor and ultimately to the construction of larger cities, and then how those cities tend to command the areas around them, creating a city-state, with these city-states then vying for more land and more power. We have the invention of the concept of an empire with the Empire of Sargon, who conquered various regions and allowed them to rule themselves as long as they were loyal to Sargon overall. And perhaps most importantly, we have the development of writing with cuneiform. Cuneiform being useful not only for practical things like business transactions, but also for artistic things and historic things like writing down histories, writing down legends, even writing down stories and poems. Cuneiform really was one of the most important inventions that we know of, probably in human history, along with the other instances where writing developed around the world. So, we'll definitely take a closer look at the Sumerians as we go, but this is our overview for now, so I'll see you next time.